Welcome to the last and final episode of Winery Equipment 3. This is the last one I will ramble on about. So let's move on and we'll talk about pumps. Pumps are a lot of fun. So, things that winery needs are pumps. And so I want to talk about classifications from the fastest to the slowest. And we're going to move through this lecture in that respect. So I want to talk about centrifugal pumps, which are really fast, then flexible impeller, positive displacement, progressive cavities, and then diaphragm and peristaltic. Now let me explain something really quickly. Flexible impeller, positive displacement, and progressive cavity pumps are all about the same speed. It depends on the size and everything else, but they can be faster or slower based on their specifications. So it isn't necessarily that they're faster or slower. They're kind of the three in the middle that can be one or the other. So the flexible impeller pump, which is what you're used to using in our cellar, they're what we have. There are reasons for that. We'll talk about that as we go on. Positive displacement pumps, they're also known as Waukesha's. So a lot of people call them Waukesha's because Waukesha's are the kind of high-end version. They're the namesake. And they're also known as positive displacement pumps. And they're important. They're some of the best pumps in the business, and they're something that we use really regularly in Washington State. And then progressive cavity pumps, which are also known as mono pumps, they're really popular in other parts of the world. And we have one at the school. It's our must pump that we dump the fruit into out of the distimmer, and it'll pump anything, so including your arm if you let it. So we'll talk a little bit more as we go on about how these different pumps work. So centrifugal pumps are really the simplest pump. They're very simple. There's a nice simple impeller that moves very fast. It's kind of similar to a turbocharger if you're into cars. It sucks the wine in and pushes it out. They are very fast. They're very simple machines. So if you look at it, there's a motor attached to an impeller, and that's it. There's no gears. There's no interface. There's nothing to wear out. They're very simple machines. And that's the upside to centrifugal pumps is there's really very little to break. They're very reliable, they're very useful, and they're very fast. The upside to these is there are very few moving parts. They're really reliable. They're really fast. They're fairly inexpensive because there's not a lot of pieces to them. They're really simple. And the upside is if you've got a bunch of cellar hands that don't know what they're doing and they accidentally start pumping the juice and then walk away, start staring at their phone, start doing all the simple things that cellar hands do that have never done this before, and all of a sudden the wine runs out, nothing happens. Nothing at all. They just run out, and the impeller spins and cavitates, and the pump stops, and nothing wears out. There's no burnout. There's nothing. It's just fine. The downside is it can only move juice and wine. It can't move skins. It can't move anything else. The high shear forces will shred skins. I mean, it's like a Cuisinart for pumping wine. The other side is it doesn't pull suction. So if you want to clean it out, it's really tough unless you have a siphon to begin with. So it's got to be primed. It's really hard. And again, these shear forces are really high. It'll blender up anything. It's just like a blender in a container. So, and the other thing is that these move so fast when they're at full flow and they're full of juice. If you dead end them, meaning you close a valve, the liquid velocity moving so fast is like hitting brakes at 100 miles an hour, but hitting a wall, and it causes things to explode and shear. It'll blow up the pump, blow up all other sorts of things. So these aren't things you can just sort of shut off at a whim when the tank's full. So again, there's advantages and disadvantages to every one of these pumps. The upside is these are the fastest, they're the simplest, but downside is they can't pull a suction and you can't just shut them off at whim. Flexible impeller pumps. So this is what you guys are used to, and we've used these in the cellars, and these are really simple machines. So just see how it works, and we basically have a rubber stator that's rotating around in a circle, and it's pulling liquid into the pump and then pushing it out. The downside to these is that rubber stator that's rotating around, you can see how it's bending over and over and over and over again. And if you think about that, bending regularly, no matter what you do, and they go both directions, is going to cause some cracking and other things like that to happen. So they wear out pretty easily. But just take a look at that and look at that diagram and sort of get an idea how these work. They're very simple and they're very flexible, not only because they're a flexible impeller, because you can see that the impeller itself is quite flexible. It's also because, well, they can take some abuse. So the advantage is these are really readily available. You can buy them anywhere. They're fairly inexpensive. They're really forgiving, which is why we have them in the cellar for amateur winemakers such as yourself trying to figure things out. They will pull a suction. So the great thing about these is they pull a better suction than any other pump. Well, monos pull pretty good suction, but these pull a really good suction. And they can pump anything. They'll pump a must. They'll pump whatever you want. They're really good for that. If you take a look at that picture down below, you can see that there's a little crossover. So if you want to save your pump and make it work as long as you can put a valve in between the front and the back. So if you crack, if suddenly if the pump is moving around really fast and you close the valve really quick, you can put something in place that allows the liquid to continue to circulate through the pump. And why this is important is because the flexible impeller itself, if it runs dry, it's rubber. And that rubber impeller, if it runs dry, and if you think about rubber running against something dry with no lubricant or anything else like that, it's going to get warm. And when it gets warm and there's increased friction, it gets hotter and hotter and hotter, and it'll eventually start to burn. And frequently what happens with these pumps is, someone will turn off the inlet side, and that pump will sit there and start to get hotter and hotter, and that impeller will start to smoke. And when it smokes, that smoke taint goes into the wine, and your wine will smell like burned rubber. So the key here is don't run it dry. The other thing is you can't steam these because they're rubber. It'll break the inside of the pump, and if you steam them, you'll break those rubber impellers. And steam is wonderful. We talked about sanitation. Steam is amazing, but the downside to steam is that it breaks stuff. So you can't really ever fully sterilize these. And again, impellers wear out about every other year, depending on volume. You've got to replace them. So at College Cellars, basically we make it on our maintenance schedule to replace them every 18 months, just sort of the standard thing. And that's just a bit of work. There's nothing wrong with that. You just have to understand that maintenance is something that's required. You change the oil in your car. Nobody thinks anything about that. There's just general maintenance and things you have to do. And so you've got to do that regularly. And in general, these are the highest maintenance pumps of them all. They crack and they require some troubleshooting, and they're just not the end all to be all in terms of brainless operation. They do require a little bit of work. And again, don't run them dry. So handing these to cellar hands without full on oversight is a really tricky tricky operation. And then again, they're not very fast. So when I was working in New Zealand, we had this girl from France who was completely bonkers. But the cellar staff at Indivin, where I worked at, was just trying to keep her occupied. So they told her to go, move a 1 million gallon tank from one side of the yard to another. And most people would have went and picked a centrifugal pump because it's really fast. Instead, choosing a 4-inch centrifugal pump, she chose a 2-inch flexible impeller pump. And that centrifugal pump would have moved that 1 million gallon tank in about 2 hours. But instead, that 2-inch flexible impeller, like what we have in the cellar, took 4 days. And the problem is that if you don't put valves in place and you don't shut that thing down, you don't have some way to stop it, once you start it, it has to go. That process took 6 days. Somebody had to sit and watch that tank for 6 days while that little flexible impeller pump moved from one side to the other. So it's a really slow pump. You can't dead end it without a bypass. They're not totally forgiving, but in the grand scheme of things, they work really well for entry-level wineries. And that's what I would say about flexible impeller pumps. They're really good for entry-level wineries. So if you need this, you have a limited budget. They're only a couple $1,000. You're a small winery. You need one pump for a variety of operations. You don't mind rebuilding things from time to time. You've got some mechanical skill. You don't need this if you need to move a lot of wine quickly. We've talked about that. You have a poorly trained staff, again, burning rubber. You have a larger budget. If you got more money, pick something better. If you're not mechanically inclined and don't want to wrench on things, don't buy a flexible impeller pump. If you're like me, who built his first car at 17, do it. If you know how to rebuild points on a distributor and, rebuild an engine, go for it. That's easy, no problem at all. But for most people, that's kind of a stretch. So, not something for the non mechanically inclined. If you don't feel comfortable with this kind of thing, just don't do it. And again, if the word gentle is on your label, you don't want to use something like this because it's a very aggressive type of pump. Okay, let's talk about positive displacement pumps. These are the bee's knees. They're one of my favorites. And the way that they work is we've got two metal stators rather than rubber. They're metal, and they have very close interference. And the flow goes in and then it goes out. So that suction comes in on the low end and goes out on the high pressure. The downside of these is they don't pull a really great suction, but because there's no interference, they do a really good job. So this is something we call is a Waukesha pump or a positive displacement pump. These are, again, the gold standard, but they are fairly pricey comparatively. So let's talk about them. So positive displacement pumps are amazing because they are really gentle in the grand scheme of things, especially compared to a flexible impeller. They are self-priming to a degree. They don't suck as well as a flexible impeller. They do need a little bit more effort on the front end. You'll have to massage the suction to get it started. But once it gets started, they do really well. They're kind of idiot-proof. You can run them dry. If it runs dry and it runs out of wine, the metal stators just sit there and run and spin into cavitation, and there's no burning rubber that can happen. The good side is they're reliable since there is no real interference. They run forever, and they are fairly good at variable control. You can turn up the speed, slow down the speed, and they can do it all. They can pump must, they can pump juice, they can pump wine, and they can even do bottling. If you have a relay to turn them on and off as that bottling bowl fills. The disadvantages is they're pricey. They're really heavy. Flexible impeller pumps, when we move around the cellar, weigh a fraction as much as a big positive displacement pump. They're not really fast. And the last thing you want to do is dead end them because these things build tremendous amount of pressure. And every year that I've worked at Walla Walla Community College, one of our students, that means one of you, who are going to go into your vintage, are going to go out and you're going to close the valve while it's running at full speed and you're going to go boom. So if you have one of these, think about that. If you're working with a positive displacement pump, realize you should probably slow it down before you close the valve and the tank's overflowing. Pay attention. So positive displacement pumps, why do you need it? You need one pump to do it all. You need one pump to pump must, juice, and wine. You're built like an ox, well, or me, but they are getting better. But they're really heavy pumps. They're just not easy to move around. They're not subtle. They're not light. They're fairly big. If you have a limited budget, they're really, if you don't need this, if you have a limited budget, because you're looking at 2 to 3 times the cost of a flexible impeller pump. So this is nice for bigger wineries. If you can't take things apart, you don't want to do it because these things have to come apart about every 2 or 3 months, regardless of what cleaning protocol you're using, to pull off the head, clean them up, because they get really nasty inside because there's no interference. They get really grimy and anything else. And again, if you're only going to use this for wine and barrel work, they're big, burly pumps. There are better pumps out there for doing really light, gentle day-to-day work. Okay, progressive cavity pumps. Reality is here in Washington, almost no one uses these. These are kind of relegated to Australia. And in Australia, everybody uses these. These are the bee's knees. They're the Waukeshas of Australia. And the reason why we call Waukesha pumps Waukeshas is they're from, the Northwest in a town called Waukesha. Look it up. It's true. Not joking. But monopumps are a little different. These work a bit differently. They work, in a more of a fashion like a supercharger in a car. But there's an inlet and an outlet, and they're, again, very powerful. And if you want to ever take a look on the crush pad when you're checking in one day, take a look at our Delta must pump, because our must pump is a progressive cavity pump. In the rest of the world, they call them monopumps, but this is a very common style of pump in other parts of the world. The upside is they can pump absolutely anything, must, juice, wine. As a matter of fact, we had a student one year drop one of the additions containers into our monopump. Our progressive cavity pump at the school, and it pumped it directly into the press. It will pump your arm into the press. It will pump a squirrel into the press. Whatever you want to pump to the press, it'll pump it right on in. It does not care. They are very, very good at pumping anything. The upside is they're really gentle. So when we're destimming fruit and we pump it through a monopump, whole berries come out the other side. It's really amazing. The upside is they're mechanically simple. They're a very basic design. There's not a lot of going on. There's just a rotating shaft and a stator, and that's it. They're very robust, and they can pump absolutely everything. But the upside is they're best as must pump. You don't want to use something that's this aggressive that pulls this much oxygen for day-to-day usage. The downside is they're big, they're heavy, they're not really fast. And if you run them dry, again, this is an interference pump. This is unlike the mono pump or the centrifugal pump where you don't have interference. There's a rubber surface that goes intact with another rubber surface, and they'll get hot and they will burn. And again, this is another high pressure pump. So if you dead end it, that meaning you close a valve while it's running at full speed, you'll blow hoses, you blow up the pump, or you blow off your arm. So you've got to be really careful with these types of pumps. These are not just kind of willy-nilly. They're not as forgiving as some of the other types of pumps out there. So why do you need this? You need this if you need to pump must. You have a little bit of extra money. If you're built like an ox or like me and you work in Australia, these are big, heavy pumps. You don't need this if there's a chance of running dry. You need a compact machine because they are not compact. You need to move wine quickly. They don't move quickly. Centrifugal pumps are way better. You're on a budget because they're expensive. You have a slow staff that don't know how to turn things off and they're willing to let things burn. And if you dead end it, you'll blow things up. They can build 2,000 PSI, which is enough to create a hose that will explode in very spectacular fashion, which I can attest to because I have seen our progressive cavity pump be closed without any warning, and I've seen the hoses explode and they come off the end. And this is one of those things that typically happens every vintage that leads to one of you being fired and me getting bawled out by a winery owner. So just, if you're using one of these, be careful. And I'd appreciate not being bowled out. Thank you. All right, diaphragm pumps. To be honest with you, these are some of my favorite pumps. They are moderately complicated. Or who am I kidding? Take a look at that diagram to the right. They're complicated. But these pumps are absolutely amazing because they're so simple. So let's talk about why they're simple in spite of that diagram. You can dead end them. So you're pumping along with a barrel and all of a sudden your barrel's full. It's perfectly full. Everything's just right. You don't have to turn off a relay. You don't have to turn anything off. You close the valve. And because diaphragm pumps work on air pressure, not on power, not on anything else, you close that valve and the pump turns off. So if you're bottling, you're filling up the bottling line and that float goes up and the bottling line shuts off, the pump shuts off. It works on air pressure. They're super gentle. They're fairly inexpensive. We have one in the cellar right now. If you want to look at it, it's about $500. They're really easy. They also pull great suction. The downside is they need an air compressor. They don't require power. So remember that whole talk we had about power? These don't require power. It's pretty cool. You can just plug in an air line and they just pump away. So they run on an airline, which is really nice. Again, if you work in a wet cellar where electricity could be a challenge, you don't have to worry about any of that, not one little bit. You just have an air hose that's coming out of the air compressor and you have no risk of electrocution, which is really nice. The downside is if these have a little leak in that diaphragm somewhere, you can pick up a lot of oxygen. And we know that oxygen can be good and bad for wine. We'll talk more about that. You can't pump anything dirty, so no stems or skins or anything else like that because they get in the pump and they'll clog up the whole process. And they need a lot of love. They're kind of like your heart. You got to take good care of them. And so you also can't use them to filter. So when we talk about filtration, we'll talk about why these are terrible. And the other side is they're really slow. This is not fast. This is not for somebody who's trying to get, the job done yesterday. They run pretty slow. You need this if you have a hand bottling line, which we do, or you want to do topping. They're great for that. If you have any other pumps or just starting out, this is a good thing just to start out. You have a strict budget. You do a lot of barrel work. They're really wonderful barrel work. They're very gentle. They don't beat the wine up. And you also need to have a really nice air compressor. You don't need this if you're not mechanically inclined. If you cannot rebuild something, if you cannot wrench, you cannot take things apart, you don't need one of these. If you'd like to learn more about how to wrench and take things apart, look at some of our electives or talk to me personally. I'm a big wrench. I love to wrench on things. I love to fix things. And I'd be more than happy to help you learn that. So these do not pump must. And if you can only afford one pump, this is not your pump. It's just good for basically, enhanced siphoning. Again, I adore them, but they are not the end all to be all. All right, I'm talking about peristaltic pumps. About 20 years ago, these came on the scene like they were the greatest thing ever. And basically, what they do is you have a little hose and a little roller that creates suction, and that little wheel in the middle, that triangle wheel, rotates in a circle and it creates suction and pumps the wine by just simply rolling a hose and pumping it. And these are really common. You'll see these in hospitals for dosing IV lines and things like that. But they ramp them up for wine production. And I just want to talk about them for a second because they're pretty much over. The upside is they're really gentle. The best way to pump must and must only. They can kind of do it all. They can pump wine. They can pump anything else. You can just dead end it and it's fine because there's only so much pressure will build in the tube. And they're super cool. The downside is they're big and clunky. The hose always wears out. They're not really good for big production. They're going to wear out pretty quickly. They're super expensive. And, I wrote in here, this is going back a few years, too new to the production end to make a long-term assessment of durability. Every winery I know, 10 years down the road from writing that line, doesn't use them anymore. Not one. So they're cool, but I think that ship has sailed. So we're just going to leave those alone, but I think you ought to know about them so you don't buy one. That's all. Peristaltic pumps, you want pumped to must, gently. Your small winery with a super high value product, you get $100 a bottle. You might want to have one of these for your image, but yeah, and you're willing to experiment, fine. You don't need it if you do pretty much, well, anything. So you don't need these, but I want to point them out. So you go to the show and everybody's like pointing out how cool their peristaltic pump is that they can't sell to anybody because no one's bought it in 5 years. Don't be a sucker. Okay, I want to talk about Francesca pumps. And I thought this image was hilarious. It's been up for a while. I did a Google image search for Francesca pumps, and this popped up, and I thought it was absolutely hysterical. So if you look for the yellow, that's what we're talking about. But you do a Francesca pump, this is what you get. And so Francesca pumps are pretty interesting. They're a complicated model. I would, recommend doing a YouTube search in terms of Francesca pumps to see how they work. They're fairly complicated machines, but they can kind of do a lot of different things. So the upside is they're really gentle. They have no interference part. They can do anything. You can dead end them. You can inline dose, which means while you're pumping, you can do an inline dose of bentonite or sulfur or any other things you want to do. They're programmable for volume. So if you want to do barrel work and you want to pump 59 gallons, they'll pump 59 gallons exactly. They're super cool. The downside is they're big and clunky. They're really heavy. There's lots of moving parts. They're Italian. Now, as a guy who has owned Italian cars, who is Italian in heritage, I want to tell you right now that Italian machinery is gorgeous. It's beautiful. It's amazing. But reliability may not be always one of its strong suits. So I want to kind of make you think about that whenever you buy Italian equipment. Gosh, it's flashy, but think about the reality of it. They're fairly expensive, and there's a lot of moving parts, and it's Italian. And I'm not dissing Italians in a reasonable sense, but realize that their schedule works that basically from August to September, they're off. They take a big vacation. And so if your Francesca pump breaks and you need parts, you could be 3, 4, 5 weeks out, and there's a reasonable chance you won't get your pump running again by harvest. So this isn't, saying that will happen with this company. They probably might have a fantastic customer service rep team, But my experience with Italian machinery is that when you call them during their holiday, it's very unlikely you're going to get a response. And then on top of that, they're in Italy and you're going to have to get it here. It's going to have to ship and go through customs and everything else. So I'm just trying to tell you that the more complicated piece of machinery you buy, if it happens to be Italian, you may be, or even French, you may be surfing through some channels to get that equipment running again. German machinery is very different, and so if you were to talk to anybody who drives a Ferrari versus a Porsche, you would probably get a very similar assessment. So a Francesca pump, you need this if you plan to hire Italian interns. They love them. So every place I ever worked that had a Francesca pump and we had Italian interns, they would flock to it. They would attack it. They would own it. And if you even tried to touch it, that was their pump. Don't you dare. If you have a high value product, they're fantastic. And you're space limited and you need one pump to do everything. You want to pump must, you want to pump anything, they can do it. If you have the bucks, go for it. You don't need this if you want a progressive cavity pump for pumping must, a flexible impeller pump for day-to-day use, a diaphragm pump, and a centrifugal pump to move wine. And you can do all of those things for the price of one Francesca pump. Just saying. But again, you've got to have all those other machines that all require maintenance, that all require work. Or you could just have one Francesca pump that you take care of. So they are pretty interesting. I recommend you look out how they work because they do have some serious advantages. So in pumps and review, get the right pump for the right job. Fast, centrifugal. If you're going to be loading up tankers, get a centrifugal pump. There's no other pump out there. Ease of use, if you want to, kind of idiot-proof your cellar, flexible impellers. Reliable progressive cavities are fantastic because they just work year in and year out. They never break. And one pump that can do absolutely everything, get a Francesca pump. But there's no right answer. But I just think you need to understand all of the different type of pumping options because primarily what we do as winemakers is move liquid from point A to point B and understand how they all work. And I think this is a good little background to help you as you go into your internships and go into your careers, understand what these different types of pumps are. There's no right answer, but it should help you.